Hello everybody, and welcome to this video, which is kindly sponsored by Squarespace. So this week we're constructing another gallery page using some slightly different tools. So I've added USN there, and then I'm going to add a new page. Here we go, and then add content. So there's a variety of different options. Select images, all different options for your gallery. I'm just going to select the basic one. Then I have to go in and delete the stock images that I have there, so you get an idea of what the layout is. And then I can add my own images. So these, I'm not sure, I think someone actually sent me these. This is kind of 1950s, 1960s USN as a series of ink art postcards. So they're all uploaded, but of course now it's cropped them. So I'm going to keep the grid layout the way it is. And then I'm going to go and say, right, one per section, except obviously that's not including the whole thing. Change the aspect ratio. And there are the pictures. They look quite good in real life rather than necessarily on the recording. And then just go in and change the name of the page to USN, and I'll add some more US Navy photos later on at some point. Then go back into the archive section, go to the USN that I typed in earlier, link it to the page, save, check, click, done. So if after all these little mini tutorials I've been doing you think you could build a website for maybe ideally naval history purposes, but you never know, you might want to do it for some other reason, then head over to squarespace.com/Drachinifel. You can get a free trial, and once you're ready, that little link will give you 10% off your first website or domain. So thanks once again to Squarespace for sponsoring the video, and on with the main show. So this Fun Friday might come off as a little bit rambly, and if so, I do apologise, but it's a semi-connected series of 3 points that I've come across recently that I thought I should probably share with you, as they're relatively important, both to more recent videos that have been made and also just in general. So the first thing that I'd like everyone to consider, which is probably what the title of the video is going to be more reflecting, is consideration of other points of view. Now, I don't mean by that, looking at, say, the Battle of Jutland from the British and the German side, or the Pacific War from the American and the Japanese side. What I mean is that everyone has their own preconceptions about what is meant by a question, and the theory and the framing in which you consider your answer. And within that framework, whether you want to call it personal bias, professional, not professional bias, but a professional degree of expertise that leans you in that particular direction, because bias I know it doesn't strictly, but can tend to imply negative connotations, which aren't necessarily the case, or just a certain worldview, you can interpret things into a relatively simple question or statement that will lead you down a path where you can make an evaluation and give an answer that is correct in terms of answering the question in your own perspective. But that question may technically have a completely different answer if it is being answered from a different perspective. And I think that is something that's very important to consider. It can be quite difficult to consider as well, because, of course, if you're answering a question from within your own framework and perspective, that's the thing that you've concluded, that's the thing that makes logical sense to you, and it may not occur to you that there is another way of looking at that question, or if it does occur to you, it may be difficult to frame another frame of reference, because mentally you're thinking, well, surely my frame of reference is the correct one, otherwise I wouldn't have arrived at it. Now, why am I talking about this? Well, this all comes down to a video that I shot with Ryan Szymanski from Battleship New Jersey about a week and a bit ago at this point, whilst I was in Hawaii for the Historical Naval Ships Association conference. Now, during that, and I'm not sure at this point whether or not the video is live, and so I won't spoil the majority of it, but during that, Ryan asked a question, which was, who won the Washington Naval Treaty? Who came out of it the best? And he said, I'm pretty sure we both have the same answer. And I was thinking, yep, I'm pretty sure we both have the same answer, because to me the answer is obvious, and surely the answer is also obvious to him. And so there's kind of like almost a rock paper scissors moment where everyone's surprised that you've come up with a different thing when you're both expecting the same, or something like that. Because I basically went, well, I'm pretty sure the US Navy won the Washington Naval Treaty, and simultaneously Ryan is going, well, I'm pretty sure the Royal Navy won the Washington Naval Treaty. And there's this moment where I'm sort of going, hang on a minute. Ryan knows his stuff, so he must have a logical and clear, coherent basis for why he's making this point. But I'm thinking I've got a logical, coherent point as well, and my basis of thinking says that can't possibly be the correct answer. So there's something odd going on here. What exactly is it? And as we discuss things in the video a little bit, and as we discuss things after the video was recorded as well, I realised what the issue was. I mean, it wasn't particularly an issue, it's just two different ways of looking at it, but it was an issue that I hadn't really considered in any great detail before. You see, when I think about who, quote-unquote, wins the Washington Treaty, I'm looking at it from a perspective of what did they get out of it? What ships were left over? What ships were they forced to scrap? What shape was the fleet in afterwards? And from that perspective, it's relatively easy to make a case that the US Navy, by and large, won the Washington Naval Treaty. There are some specific areas, if you break it down by ship classes, where you could say maybe the British got the advantage, if you're talking about the two major powers. But, for example, you look at aircraft carriers, well, the Americans come out of the Washington Treaty with Lexington and Saratoga. That's pretty much a straight win condition, because they're the single best treaty mandated conversions, with Glorious and Courageous way down the list at the bottom, and Akagi and Kaga somewhere in the middle. And then with cruisers, they managed to curtail the number of cruisers that are going to be built, which is a plus for them because they have to have a coherent fleet, or their strategy calls for a mostly coherent fleet, whereas the Royal Navy, scattered all over the place, has a lot more trade protection to do, and therefore needs a lot more cruisers on paper than the US Navy does. But the Royal Navy has been curtailed, so US Navy wins in that regard, and so on and so forth. But then Ryan pointed out to me that he was thinking in terms of what got cancelled. What did the various navies not have to face as a result of the Washington Naval Treaty being signed? And in that case, it's like, as soon as he said that, I thought, right, now I see where you're coming from. Now I see your point. Because from that perspective, the Royal Navy had just about laid down the keels and collected some initial materials for the G3s. The N3s had yet to be built in any way, shape or form. They'd technically been ordered, but that was about it. So if we're talking in terms of capital ships, the opposition that the US or Japanese Navy could possibly be facing, but didn't as a result of the Washington Naval Treaty, is 8 ships, but 8 ships that probably wouldn't have been in service. Well, the first one probably wouldn't come online for at least 3 or 4 years, and the last maybe for 7 or 8 years. Whereas the Japanese were forced to cancel, a bunch of Amagi and Tosa class ships, which were already well under construction, albeit again, there weren't as many as the US Navy, which had 6 Lexingtons and 6 South Dakotas on the go, a good chunk of which were well on their way through construction. So, again, just looking at the capital ships, ignoring everything else, for the moment, the Royal Navy, with the Washington Treaty, dodges a major bullet, because between the US and the Japanese, albeit the Japanese were allied with the Royal Navy prior to the Washington Treaty, but even just focusing on the US had a dozen capital ships under construction, and they were going to be in service significantly before the G3s and the N3s were. So in terms of bullets dodged, the Royal Navy kind of wins, because it forces everybody else. Again, if we're just looking at through the lens of capital ships for the purposes of this argument, you can look at all the other ship classes separately, but it mostly kind of holds true generally. The Royal Navy via the Washington Treaty, forces the US to scrap a load of capital ships that they've put a lot of money and effort into, plus, of course, the last Colorado class. And they force the Japanese, now that they're not allied with them, to scrap a bunch of capital ships that they put a lot of work and effort into. And in exchange, what do they have to do? Basically hoover up a bunch of keel-laying material, and that's about it. So, from that perspective, from what they didn't have to face, the Royal Navy, pretty much won the Washington Naval Treaty. And so you have this fundamental question of who wins the Washington Naval Treaty, and the answer could be the Royal Navy, or it could be the US Navy, depending on how you're framing your response. The question is the same, but your perspective is different. And I think in a lot of cases, not necessarily, because there are some just purely factually based questions, how thick was X armor, how much penetration did Y shell have, how fast was Z ship, but in a lot of more opinion based questions, I think it is very important, and something I have to definitely work on, as exemplified by this, to try and consider what is my frame of reference and what is my frame of reference leaving out. And as I say, it will be difficult. It may not always happen, may not always work, but it's definitely something to be aware of. I'm certainly going to try and be more aware of it, and just from a more general perspective for you listeners, if you are thinking about these kind of opinion-based questions for naval history, definitely something to keep an eye out for. Now, related to that is a question that came in one of the dry docks, and I responded, and it was to do with prize money, specifically prize money when it came to the West Africa Squadron and anti-slaving patrols and so forth. Now, the original question was basically, how did the Admiralty calculate prize money, if they did at all, from what you might call non-traditional sources of things that the Royal Navy had seized, whether that be material goods on shore, fortifications, non-warship things, and it was mentioned in the context of things like the anti-slavery operations, which sometimes were at sea, but sometimes were also coastal. And part of my response was talked about the capture of a slaving ship, and if it was taken to an Admiralty prize court, I stated that the ship itself could be assessed for prize value and money paid accordingly, but that the slaves that were aboard, that were freed, would not attract prize money, because prize money was assessed against material value of property, and the whole point of the anti-slavery patrols was that slaves were not property, therefore you couldn't assess value against them, and they would go free. And this was an answer that I based on reading a number of Admiralty court documents with regards to the anti-slavery patrol a few years ago, and to a letter they were all basically, you've got all the legalese. Where was this ship captured? Whose flag was it flying under? Whose flag does it actually belong to? What's the assessed value of the ship? Can we take it as a prize? Or do we have to return it? And so on and so forth. All the standard arguments you have in Admiralty prize courts around that point. But where the ships were assessed as, could be taken as prizes and there was prize value to be assessed, the only notes that you had about the freed slaves was that the free slaves had been discharged ashore at whatever location they'd been put ashore. And there was nothing in the documents about awarding prize money for the capture of the slaves, or liberation of the slaves, depending on how you look at it. And a few people in the comments popped up and said, well, actually, I think you're wrong there, Drac. There was money paid for freed slaves during the anti-slavery patrols, and they actually even gave some figures and how they started off and how that amount trended down and so forth. And I thought to myself, okay, well, these people have clearly got a fair degree of documentation and evidence behind what they're saying, but equally I've got documentation and evidence behind what I'm saying, so where is things going slightly wrong? And it basically came down, after a bit more digging, to terminology, which was, yes, there was reward money paid to the Royal Navy crews per slave freed when they freed slaves during the West Africa Patrol and other similarly anti-slavery activities. But although it was paid out with the prize money, it, technically speaking, by the legal definition of things, was not prize money for the reasons that I said earlier. You know, slaves were not considered property, therefore you can't assess a property value for them, therefore the Admiralty Court, that is the prize court, doesn't adjudicate a value for them. But the money was paid out at the same time, but from a separate, it was basically, if you like, a head money, as it was sometimes called in some documents. It was a separate reward scheme that was set up. But since obviously all the capture and everything happened and liberation of the slaves happened at the same time, the collective amount of money was often paid out in a whole lump sum. So using slightly arbitrary values, if the ship itself had been assessed at a value of, let's say, £5,000, bear in mind we are talking about the 19th century, and the slaves that had been liberated had a total head money value of £1,000, then the crew would receive a overall payment of £6,000, 5,000 plus 1,000, which then got distributed according to the prize rules of the time. So from a overall sense, yes, they were being paid for liberating slaves, but from a strictly technical perspective, they weren't being paid prize money for the liberation of the slaves. And the point I'm trying to make from this particular incident is that you can run the risk, as I did in that particular case, of looking at things from a slightly too narrow perspective. So, you know, the question was specifically prize money. So I said, okay, right, this is the definition of prize money. It doesn't compute with the particular categorization of slaves by the Royal Navy in the 19th century. Therefore, you stop there and you go, right, well, therefore, that doesn't happen. But I didn't look at things in the wider context where, everything I just said previously. So my answer was technically correct, but in this case, technically correct was not the best kind of correct because it was not contextually correct. And that indicates two things. One of which is, broaden your outlook slightly when you're trying to find the answer to a question, which again is something I need to do, and consider the wider context of what might be being asked in principle rather than what's necessarily being asked in pure technical language. So in that case, where the question says, were the Royal Navy crews paid prize money for these things, then perhaps I should have looked at it and gone, okay, well, I'm going to interpret that as, were the Royal Navy crews paid for these things, even if it wasn't technically within the realm of prize money. Now, of course, that's a very delicate balance to cast, because sometimes people are asking a very specific question, or sometimes broadening a question that's been asked might, open things up a little bit too much. But again, it's something to consider. It's something, as just mentioned, that I did trip over slightly on from a broader contextual point of view, and therefore something that I will try and avoid tripping up on in the future. Now, the last thing I want to briefly mention is with regards to the video that I did on Cordite and Poudre B. Now, most of the comments were in relation to Cordite, and specifically the ones I want to try and address are in relation to the crystals of nitroglycerin that I mentioned. Now, a number of people who have experience with explosives mentioned that nitroglycerin is a liquid at room temperature, and therefore it would be implausible for there to be crystals of nitroglycerin present in the magazines and elsewhere on the ship. Now, in modern nitroglycerin concentrations, that is absolutely 100% true. Look at the standard properties of nitroglycerin. However, what I was saying in the video was not without foundation, because before the video I checked through quite a lot of different ammunition reports, ammunition handling reports, and ammunition handling guidelines specifically for well, some of them more generally for Cordite, and others very specifically Royal Navy magazine ammunition handling instructions ranging from the 1900s through the 1910s, 20s, and into the 30s. And various of them contain various details on this, and a number of them are quite explicit in stating that below certain temperatures, and bearing in mind that the magazines on battleships are cooled to stop deterioration and also to ensure a stable temperature of the propellant when it's fired. And it specifically mentions that, if the temperature of the magazine falls below this temperature, that crystals of nitroglycerin will sweat out of the cordite charge. And obviously they're saying you don't let that happen. And the reason why I say this temperature or that temperature rather than a specific temperature is because a number of the manuals, especially around the late 1910s, early 1920s period, are actually very specific about the fact that this occurs at different temperatures depending on which cordite you're using. So the earliest cordite has the highest temperature at which this will occur, and then cordite MD, the follow-on, has a slightly lower temperature, and then the latest cordite, which they mention, has a lower temperature still. Now, with the two latter mixtures, that temperature is actually, low enough that you'd have serious other problems in the magazine, like serious condensation issues apart from anything else, if you had things down to that lower temperature. And so it's relatively safe, but they still have these cautions that basically say don't let your magazine temperatures fall to this low because that'll happen. So it clearly is possible, but the temperature at which the original flavour cordite is capable of crystallizing out is actually well within the temperature ranges for magazines in the 1900s and 1910s, especially if you're based in northern waters. And as those leaflets and manuals might indicate, the temperature at which this crystallization is occurring depends quite a lot on the mixture that the cordite has been made up of, and also, how pure or impure that is. So, this is talking about the theoretical, assuming the instructions have been followed in the manufacture of the cordite, and as we know from various documents and sources, including, some of the British Army's issues with shells and their propellants during the war on the Western Front, whether or not the quality control was there in the first place to ensure that the instructions were being followed in the manufacture is another thing as well. Plus, obviously, the deterioration of the cordite as time went on, which again is going to affect the chemical makeup of things. So the Royal Navy was aware at the time, to the point they wrote it into their ammunition handling manuals for magazines, that crystallization of the nitroglycerin could occur. It also mentions that if the temperature rises, then one of two things can occur once the crystallization has occurred, depending on how much the ammunition has sweated. Firstly, if you're lucky, it might become, this sweaty, if you like, charge, which will then reabsorb the nitroglycerin. But if there's too much of it, or if your crystallization has been going along for too long, then the nitroglycerin, once it turns back into a liquid as the temperature rises, will impregnate itself in everything around it. And it actually, in one manual, specifically mentions things like the cases that the charges are contained in, which at this point are mostly leather, which leads to the rather horrific idea of nitroglycerin impregnated charge cases. The things that are meant to keep the charge safe from catching fire or exploding. Yeah, guess what? They're now saturated with liquid nitroglycerin. Have fun. And it also mentions any items or porous surfaces that it may come into contact with, for obvious reasons. Now, that can include, obviously, if the shell is being, pulled through magazines and onto hoists and everything, the various surfaces involved aren't metal, but also, dust and other things that might be accumulating around in the magazines and in the gun houses and so forth. Because something else that a number of you mentioned was that, if you're exposed to nitroglycerin, you end up with, headaches and all sorts of other symptoms as well, which would be something of a telltale sign. Whereas, obviously, then when you look at Gunnar Grant's report from Lion and one or two others, you see that the dust in the magazines was completely flammable to a dangerous degree, but the staff who worked in there didn't really seem to be suffering otherwise from significant ill effects. So, I mean, we were discussing more of the general principles based on the evidence to hand in the video, and perhaps there's some further research to be done there to determine what happens or what potentially happened to these crystals of nitroglycerin in the aftermath of their being formed in the magazine. So clearly it was an issue the Royal Navy was aware of, but then, some more detailed work into just how low were the temperatures of the magazines kept, because obviously there's variation. There's logs, multiple logs that the officers in there are supposed to keep that say this was the lowest temperature in the magazine today, this was the highest temperature. There's all sorts of indicators that were made as well to show that for when people weren't necessarily paying attention every minute of every day. So what's the average temperature of the magazine in a British capital ship? And then compare that to the crystallization temperature specified for specific types of cordite, factor in chemical deterioration and how the change in the chemical mixture might affect that point, and then also consider that liquid nitroglycerin, if the temperatures are higher, may then mix itself with other third-party objects to form some kind of semi-stable dust that isn't necessarily going to cause everybody problems immediately, etc., etc. And then, how much the ventilation systems within the ship might play into evacuating evaporated nitroglycerin, but perhaps that is being replenished, whether it be in crystal form or liquid mixed with dust and other things form, as shells are constantly being cycled through the ship on gunnery exercises and so forth. So there is certainly a lot more work to be done on it, even if the general principles, I think, at least from the evidence available, is sound. But I do deeply appreciate those of you with more expertise specifically in that field writing in both the comments and via emails, because it prompted me to double check everything that I'd looked into and look even further still to make sure that what I was saying had a foundation in reality. And that's opened up, as I've just mentioned, potential further avenues of research. So rather than being a kind of a general overview video that gets into some of the details but not all of them, perhaps this might even become a research paper looking at the exact chemical formulations and, based on what the Royal Navy documents have said, perhaps we can then go and reconstruct, because obviously I will need to work with my guest, perhaps we can reconstruct exactly what the likely chemical mixtures would have to be in order for the nitroglycerin crystallization to occur at these varying temperatures. And then we can look at, okay, well, based on those chemical formulations, how quickly would these things start to decay, at what temperatures, and at what stage in that decay, especially given some of the known impurities in the formulations that were occurring, at what stage during that might that affect the temperature at which the crystallization occurs? And are these crystals going to be absolutely 100% pure nitroglycerin, or are they perhaps going to form around silk fibers or something? What are the impurities? How might that affect its ability to detonate on command? How much of a shock would it need to detonate? All these things that are opened up as avenues of research, thanks in large part to you guys questioning the original basic outline. So thank you very much for that, even if it has created a bunch more work. Anyway, that's enough rambling for me for this Friday. Thanks very much for listening, and look forward to your comments discussing the various points I've talked about in the comments below. Bye.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.